The sound of glass shattering against the saloon wall silenced the rowdy patrons of Redemption Creek, a dusty frontier town that had sprouted like a stubborn weed along the Union Pacific Railroad in Wyoming Territory. 1877. Grace Valmont stood amid the wreckage of her medicine show supplies, her emerald eyes narrowed at the sneering crowd of cowboys and miners who had just destroyed 6 months of her hard work. "Snake oil," shouted a red-faced miner. "My wife's consumption got worse after drinking your miracle tonic." "I never claimed it cured consumption," Grace countered, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. At 24, she had faced her share of skeptics, but never a mob. "My tonics are for digestive ailments, and you're nothing but a pretty-faced fraud," called another voice, followed by a chorus of agreement. Sheriff Tate Adams leaned against the bar, making no move to intervene. "Miss Valmont, I think it's best you pack up what's left and move on. Redemption Creek has had enough of your miracles." Grace set her jaw, dignity keeping her spine straight as she gathered the few unbroken bottles into her worn leather satchel. The last 3 towns had been the same initial welcome, followed by hostility when her remedies couldn't perform the impossible. Her father's recipes had helped many, but expectations always outpaced reality. As the saloon door swung shut behind her, Grace stepped into the crisp autumn air, only to collide with a solid wall of man. "Whoa there," came a deep voice, steady hands catching her shoulders to prevent her from falling. Grace looked up and up further into the face of a stranger. Dust from the trail clung to his clothes, but his eyes were clear and blue as Wyoming's summer sky. He wore no badge, but the confident set of his shoulders and the well-worn Colt at his hip marked him clearly as a man comfortable with the harsh realities of the frontier. "My apologies," she said stiffly, stepping back. "No harm done." He nodded toward the saloon door. "Sounds like quite a commotion in there. Just the good citizens of Redemption Creek expressing their opinion of my business ventures." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "And what business might that be?" Before she could answer, the saloon door burst open again and a bottle flew out, shattering at their feet. "There's more where that came from, which?" someone called from inside. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and without hesitation, he placed himself between Grace and the door. "I think introductions are in order," he said calmly, never taking his eyes off the potential threat. "Zachariah Hayes, most just call me Zach." "Grace Valmont," she replied. "And I assure you, Mr. Hayes, I require no protection. This isn't the first town to decide I'm unwelcome." Zach glanced at her satchel. "Medicine peddler, herbalist," she corrected, though few bother to understand the distinction. A commotion from inside the saloon suggested the angry crowd might be working up the courage to continue their harassment outside. "Miss Valmont, I've just ridden 20 miles on an empty stomach and would appreciate some conversation that doesn't involve shouting. Perhaps we could discuss the difference between snake oil and herbalism over a meal somewhere quieter." Grace hesitated. Trust came at a high premium in her experience, but something about Zachariah Hayes' direct gaze told her he wasn't the type to waste time on deception. "The cafe at the end of the street has decent stew," she conceded. "But I should warn you, association with me might damage your standing in town before you've even established one. I reckon I'll take my chances." The cafe was nearly empty at this hour, the lunch crowd long gone and the dinner patrons yet to arrive. A tired-looking waitress showed them to a corner table and promised to return with stew and coffee. "So," Zach began, removing his hat and setting it on the empty chair beside him, "what brings an herbalist to Redemption Creek?" Grace traced a finger over a knot in the wooden table. "The same thing that brings me to any town people who need remedies they can afford. Not everyone can pay a doctor's fees, and some ailments respond well to the right herbs and treatments." "And some don't," Zach observed. "No," she admitted, "some don't. But I never promise what I can't deliver, Mr. Hayes. That's not how my father taught me." "Your father was an herbalist too, a doctor, actually. Trained in Philadelphia, he served in the war and afterward found that many soldiers and civilians alike couldn't afford proper medical care. He began studying traditional remedies to supplement his practice." A shadow crossed her face. "After he died, I continued his work the best I could." The waitress returned with 2 steaming bowls and a pot of coffee that smelled better than it likely tasted. "And you, Mr. Hayes?" Grace asked after sampling the stew. What brings you to Redemption Creek, cattle? I'm moving a small herd north to my new spread about 15 miles from here. Left my men to make camp while I rode ahead to arrange some supplies. You're settling here. Grace couldn't hide her surprise. Zachariah Hayes had the look of a man who rarely stayed in one place long enough to leave footprints. Been driving cattle across 4 territories for 8 years, he said. Time to put down some roots. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the simple meal tasting better than Grace had expected, or perhaps it was just the relief of sitting across from someone who wasn't shouting accusations. What happened in there? Zach finally asked, nodding in the direction of the saloon. Grace sighed. Mrs. Thornfield has consumption. Her husband purchased my digestive tonic, convinced himself it would cure her despite my explicit warnings to the contrary when her condition worsened. She spread her hands in a helpless gesture, and the town took his side. They always do. I'm an outsider, a woman selling remedies from a wagon. It's easier to blame me than accept that some illnesses can't be cured. Zach considered her for a long moment. Where will you go now? There's a settlement about 30 miles east. I'll try my luck there. 30 miles is a long way for a woman alone, especially with winter coming on, Grace bristled. I've traveled further in worse conditions, Mr. Hayes. He held up a hand. I don't doubt your capabilities, Miss Valmont, but practicality isn't a sin. My new property needs a lot of work, and my men and I could use someone with knowledge of medicinal herbs. The nearest doctor is in Cheyenne. Grace blinked. Are you offering me employment? Room and board in exchange for your services when needed, plus freedom to cultivate your herbs and prepare your remedies. Come spring, if you still want to move on, I won't stop you. You don't know me. I know enough. His gaze was steady. You're honest about what your remedies can and can't do. That's rare in your line of work. Why would you help a stranger? Something flickered across Zach's face, a memory, perhaps, or an old pain. Let's just say I've seen what happens when medical help is too far away when it's needed. Having someone with your knowledge nearby would be valuable to more than just me. Grace studied him, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but found only sincerity. Your men might not appreciate having a witch in their midst. A smile tugged at Zach's mouth. My men know better than to question my decisions, Miss Valmont. Besides, most of them have been on the trail long enough to appreciate any medical attention that doesn't involve cauterizing wounds with heated knife blades. Grace couldn't help but smile at that. A compelling argument. I'll be heading back to my camp tomorrow morning. You're welcome to join me or continue east on your own. Your choice. Grace's practical nature warred with her instinct for self-preservation. Winter in Wyoming was brutal, and traveling alone was risky at best. Yet accepting help from a stranger carried its own dangers. Before she could respond, the cafe door swung open, and Sheriff Adams stepped in, his expression hardening when he spotted Grace. Miss Valmont, he said coldly. I believe I made myself clear about you leaving town. Zach leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Evening, Sheriff. Don't believe we've met. Zachariah Hayes. The sheriff nodded curtly. Mr. Hayes, I'd advise caution in your choice of company. Miss Valmont has caused considerable distress among our citizens. By serving stew in a public cafe? Zach's voice was mild, but Grace detected an edge beneath. By selling false hopes in bottles? Adams snapped. Grace opened her mouth to defend herself, but Zach spoke first. Sheriff, I've just purchased Miss Valmont's entire stock of remedies for my ranch. She'll be leaving town with me tomorrow, which I believe satisfies your concerns. Grace stared at him, trying to mask her surprise. The sheriff looked between them, suspicion evident. You'd be wise to check those bottles carefully, Mr. Hayes. I always examine what I pay for, Zach replied evenly. Good evening, Sheriff. Adams lingered a moment longer, then turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him with unnecessary force. You didn't have to do that, Grace said quietly. No, Zach agreed, but it simplified matters. He met her eyes directly. What'll it be, Miss Valmont? East alone or north with me? Grace took a deep breath. I have a wagon and a mule at the livery. We'll collect them in the morning. Dawn broke cold and clear over Redemption Creek as Grace secured the last of her possessions in her wagon. She had spent the night in the town's modest boarding house, sleep eluding her as she questioned her decision to trust Zachariah Hayes. Yet when he appeared at the livery stable precisely when promised, something in her chest eased. He rode a sturdy buckskin gelding and led a second horse, a chestnut mare. "Good morning, Miss Valmont," he greeted. "I see you're ready to depart, Mr. Hayes." She nodded. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all." He dismounted and approached her wagon, examining the old mule with a critical eye. "This fellow looks like he's seen better days." "Bartholomew has carried me faithfully for 3 years," Grace defended. "He's stronger than he looks." Zach smiled. "I'm sure he is, but the trail to my ranch crosses some rough country. I think we'd best leave your wagon here and pack what you need on the mare. We can send for the rest once you're settled." Grace frowned. "I can't abandon my supplies, they're my livelihood." "Not abandoning," Zach corrected. "Storing. I've arranged with the liveryman to keep your wagon, and whatever you can't carry now, we'll return for it within the week." Grace wanted to argue but knew he was right. Her small wagon wasn't built for rugged terrain, and Bartholomew, faithful as he was, would struggle with a difficult trail. "Very well," she conceded. "Give me an hour to sort what's essential." It took closer to 2 hours, but Zach made no complaint as Grace carefully selected her most valuable herbs, equipment, and personal belongings. The mare, whom Zach introduced as Penny, accepted the additional load without protest. By mid-morning, they were heading north out of Redemption Creek, Grace riding Penny while Zach led the way on his gelding. She felt the stares of townspeople following them, heard the whispers. The witch and the fool who believed in her. They rode in comfortable silence for much of the day, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and once for a simple lunch of jerky and hard biscuits. As the sun began its westward slide, Grace noticed Zach checking the sky with increasing frequency. "Problem?" she asked. "Weather's changing," he replied. "We'd best push on. My camp's about 3 miles ahead." True to his word, they crested a small rise just as twilight deepened, revealing the glow of a campfire in the valley below. As they approached, Grace could make out several wagons, a makeshift corral holding a few dozen cattle, and the silhouettes of men moving about the camp. One of them spotted their approach and called out, "That you, boss?" "It's me, Ellie," Zach confirmed. "Found us some civilization in town, such as it is." The men gathered as Zach and Grace rode into the camp's circle of light. Grace counted 6 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 18 to well past 50, all regarding her with undisguised curiosity. "Boys," Zach said, dismounting and moving to help Grace down from Penny. "This is Miss Grace Valmont. She's an herbalist who will be joining us at the ranch. Miss Valmont, meet the sorry bunch I call a crew." Grace stood tall as Zach introduced each man. Ellie Whitman, his foreman Thomas Cooper, cook and former Army scout, brothers Sam and Jesse Patterson, young Andy Miller, barely out of boyhood, and Frank Wilson, whose weathered face suggested he'd seen every hardship the frontier could offer. "An herbalist," Ellie repeated, skepticism clear in his voice. "Like a medicine woman, I prepare natural remedies from plants and other materials," Grace explained, her chin lifting slightly, "for common ailments and injuries." "Miss Valmont's knowledge will be valuable once we're settled," Zach said firmly. "She'll have the cabin by the creek to set up her practice." Grace's eyes widened slightly. This was the first she'd heard of her own cabin, but she kept her expression neutral. "Hope you know how to treat frostbite, madam," Frank commented, nodding toward the darkening sky. "That's snow coming, sure as I'm standing here." As if summoned by his words, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, landing on Grace's shoulders and melting into the fabric of her coat. "Get the horses settled," Zach ordered. "And Thomas, is there stew left?" "Enough for 2 more," the cook confirmed, already moving toward the fire. Within minutes, the snowfall intensified. Grace found herself seated on a log by the fire, a tin plate of surprisingly good stew in her hands, while the men secured the camp against the coming storm. Zach moved among them efficiently, his quiet authority evident in how they responded to his directions. "First snow's always early out here," Thomas explained, settling beside her with his own plate. "But this one's got a mean look to it." "Will the cattle be all right?" Grace asked. "They'll bunch up, keep each other warm. Cattle been surviving Wyoming winters since before any of us got here." He studied her for a moment. "Boss says you're good with herbs and such." "I know my way around natural remedies," she acknowledged. Thomas nodded. My grandmother was Cherokee. She could find medicine in plants most folks would step right over, saved more than a few lives during the war that way. Grace felt a small warmth of connection. My father combined traditional medicine with his formal training. He taught me that healing doesn't always come from a doctor's bag. Smart man. Thomas glanced toward Zach, who was helping secure a wagon cover against the wind. The boss is a good judge of character. If he brought you along, he sees something worth having around. The snowfall grew heavier as night deepened. Zach returned to the fire and accepted a cup of coffee from Thomas. "Storm's settling in," he announced. "Miss Valmont, we've prepared the supply wagon for you. It's not fancy, but it'll keep you dry tonight." "Thank you," she said. "I've slept in worse conditions." Later, tucked into the relative shelter of the canvas-covered wagon with extra blankets Thomas had insisted she take, Grace listened to the howl of the wind and the occasional lowing of cattle. The men had distributed themselves among the other wagons and a small tent, with Zach taking first watch. Despite the cold and unfamiliar surroundings, Grace felt a curious sense of peace. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone facing whatever tomorrow might bring. It was a dangerous feeling. Dependence had never served her well, but as she drifted towards sleep, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps Zachariah Hayes' offer might prove to be exactly what she needed. The storm raged for 3 days. What had been planned as a simple overnight camp became an extended struggle against Wyoming's early winter fury. The men worked in shifts to keep the cattle from scattering, while Grace quickly found her place helping Thomas prepare meals and tending to minor injuries: frostbitten fingers, a twisted ankle when Sam slipped on ice, and the persistent cough that plagued young Andy. On the morning of the 4th day, Grace awoke to silence. The relentless wind had finally ceased. She emerged from her wagon to find the world-transformed blankets of pristine white covered the landscape, the rising sun casting a pink glow across the snow. Zach stood a few yards away, surveying the cattle. He turned as Grace approached, and the smile he offered her sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Morning, Miss Valmont," he greeted. "Sleep well." "Better than expected," she admitted. "The storm's passed, for now." He nodded toward the northwest. "We should move out as soon as possible. There's more weather coming, and I'd rather be at the ranch when it hits." "How far?" "About 10 miles. Rough going in these conditions, but we should make it by nightfall." He hesitated. "The men were talking last night." "About that tea you made for Andy's cough." Grace tensed, prepared for criticism. "It's just horehound and wild cherry bark with a bit of honey. They were impressed," Zach interrupted. "Frank said it's the first night Andy hasn't kept everyone awake with his hacking." "Oh." Grace blinked in surprise. "It's a simple remedy. Simple or not, it worked, and that matters to men who are usually days from proper medical care." Zach's blue eyes studied her face. "You've been a welcome addition to this camp, Miss Valmont. I wanted you to know that." Before she could respond, Ali approached. "Boss, we're ready to move out whenever you give the word." The journey to Zach's ranch was slow and arduous. The cattle moved reluctantly through the snow, and twice they had to stop to free a wagon wheel from deep drifts. Grace rode beside Thomas' chuck wagon, listening to his stories of life on the frontier and sharing some of her own experiences as a traveling herbalist. "People are quick to dismiss what they don't understand," Thomas observed after Grace recounted her reception in Redemption Creek. "Then just as quick to come asking for help when conventional medicine fails them." "That's been my experience," Grace agreed. "They call me witch or fraud until they're desperate. Then suddenly I'm their last hope." "Must be lonely," Thomas said quietly. Grace looked ahead to where Zach rode point, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. "It has been," she admitted. The sun was setting when they finally crested a ridge, and Grace got her first view of what Zach had been calling his ranch. Below them sprawled a small valley protected by hills on 3 sides. A creek cut through the center, its course marked by a line of cottonwood trees. Near the creek stood several structures. A main house built of solid logs, a large barn, what appeared to be a bunkhouse, and several smaller outbuildings. A distance away, she could see the cabin Zach had mentioned, small but sturdy-looking, with a stone chimney. "Welcome to Miracle Creek Ranch," Zach said, having fallen back to ride alongside her. "Miracle Creek," Grace repeated. A slight flush colored Zach's weathered cheeks. Named for the way I found this place, got caught in a blizzard 2 years ago, was sure I was done for. Stumbled into this valley half frozen and found shelter in what's now the main house. Previous owner had abandoned it. Seemed like a miracle at the time. Grace studied the property with new eyes. It's beautiful. It needs work, Zach acknowledged. But it has good water, decent grazing, and enough timber to keep warm through winter. He nodded toward the distant cabin. That was the original homesteader's first building before he built the main house. Should suit your needs, I think. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The cattle were settled into a meadow where the snow was thinner. Supplies were unloaded and organized, and everyone focused on preparing for the long winter ahead. Grace spent her first day exploring her new home. The cabin was basic but sound, with a small bedroom, a main room with a fireplace, and an attached lean-to that would serve perfectly for preparing her remedies. On her third day at Miracle Creek, Zach appeared at her door with a wagon loaded with her belongings from town. The storm let up enough yesterday that Ali and I made a run to Redemption Creek, he explained as they unloaded her supplies. Figured you'd want your things sooner rather than later. Grace carefully placed a box of dried herbs on her new work table. Thank you. I hope the townspeople weren't too difficult about it. Zach's mouth quirked. Sheriff Adams seemed mighty confused about why I'd want to bring a snake oil peddler back to my ranch. I told him good help is hard to find out here. Grace paused in her unpacking. Is that what I am? Help? Zach set down the crate he was carrying and faced her directly. You're whatever you choose to be, Miss Valmont. I offered you a place to practice your craft in exchange for medical assistance when needed. Beyond that, your business is your own. The sincerity in his voice eased something in Grace's chest. I appreciate that, Mr. Hayes, truly. That evening, Grace joined the men for supper in the main house for the first time. The large kitchen was warm from the cooking fire, and Thomas had outdone himself with a meal of venison stew and fresh bread made from supplies brought from town. As they ate, Grace noticed the easy camaraderie among the men. They teased each other mercilessly but with obvious affection, and all showed a clear respect for Zach that went beyond his position as their employer. Miss Valmont, called young Andy from across the table, Mr. Thomas says you might have something for my hands. He held up his palms, which were raw and chapped from working in the cold. I have a salve that should help, Grace confirmed. I'll bring some over tomorrow. The lady ain't even been here a week and already you're bothering her with your ailments, Frank grumbled good-naturedly. Actually, Grace said, I'd be grateful if all of you would let me know of any medical needs you have. It would help me determine which remedies to prepare first. The men exchanged glances, then Ali spoke up. Frank's knee gives him fits when the weather changes. Sam snores loud enough to wake the dead. Jesse gets headaches something fierce when he doesn't get enough sleep. Soon they were all talking at once, each offering complaints both serious and trivial. Grace listened carefully, making mental notes, while Zach watched with a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Later, as Grace prepared to return to her cabin, Zach walked her to the door. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For putting them at ease. Most of these men haven't had a woman show interest in their well-being in years. Grace looked up at him, noticing for the first time the small lines at the corners of his eyes, the thread of silver at his temples. He wasn't young, perhaps mid-30s, but there was a vitality to him that made age seem irrelevant. They're good men, she said. I'm glad to help them. Zach nodded, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Good night, Miss Valmont. Good night, Mr. Hayes. As weeks passed, Grace settled into life at Miracle Creek Ranch. She established a routine, spending mornings gathering and preparing herbs, afternoons seeing to the various complaints of the ranch hands, and evenings often in the company of Zach and the others. She set up a small garden plot in the lean-to, using pots and containers to grow essential herbs that couldn't be gathered in winter. Word of her presence spread to neighboring homesteads, and occasionally folks would arrive seeking her remedies. Some were skeptical at first, but Zach's endorsement carried weight, and soon Grace found herself with a modest but steady stream of patients. December brought heavier snow and the kind of bone-deep cold that made even the hardiest souls seek shelter. On the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, Thomas organized a small celebration, roasting a wild turkey and producing a jug of whiskey that had been saved for a special occasion. As the men gathered around the fire after dinner, sharing stories and passing the jug, Grace found herself seated beside Zach on a bench near the hearth. The warm light played across his features, softening the weather-worn lines of his face. "Happy solstice," he said, offering her a small cup of the amber liquid. Grace accepted it with a smile. "And to you, your men seem to be enjoying themselves. They've earned it. It's been a hard month." He gestured toward Andy, who was demonstrating a jig while Frank played a harmonica. "Haven't seen them this lively in a while." Grace sipped her whiskey, letting the warmth spread through her chest. "They're good men," she repeated her sentiment from weeks earlier. "They are," Zach agreed, "and they think the world of you, you know." "Miss Grace's miracle cures, they call your remedies." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the whiskey. "Hardly miracles, just knowledge handed down and refined over generations. To men who have gone most of their lives with no medical care beyond whiskey and a hot knife, what you do seems miraculous indeed." Zach's voice lowered. "It does to me as well." Grace looked up, caught by the intensity in his blue eyes. "Mr. Hayes, Zach," he corrected gently. "After all this time, I think we've earned first names, don't you?" "Zach," she conceded, liking the way it felt on her tongue. "Then you must call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her breath catch. "It suits you." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted as Ellie and Sam started an impromptu wrestling match, sending the others scrambling to clear space and place bets. The moment between them passed, but Grace felt it lingering like a promise as the evening continued. The first major blizzard of winter struck 3 days after Christmas, howling out of the northwest with a fury that pinned everyone to their respective shelters for nearly 2 days. When it finally abated, Grace emerged from her cabin to find the snow piled halfway up her door, the path to the main house completely obliterated. She had just begun trying to clear a path when she heard shouting from the direction of the bunkhouse. Shading her eyes against the glare of sun on snow, Grace saw several of the men gathered outside, gesturing frantically. Abandoning her efforts, she waded through the deep snow toward them, her heart racing as she recognized the urgency in their voices. "Miss Grace." Andy called when he spotted her. "It's Jesse, he's bad hurt." Grace quickened her pace, reaching them breathless. "What happened?" "Roof of the south shelter collapsed under the snow," Illy explained grimly. "Jesse was inside checking on a calf. Beam caught him across the back and leg." Grace followed them into the bunkhouse, where Jesse lay on his bunk, face contorted in pain. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle below the knee, and when Grace carefully lifted the blanket, she could see blood seeping through his torn trousers. "Where's Zach?" she asked, already assessing the injury. "Went to check the cattle in the north pasture," Frank said. "Sam rode out to find him." Grace took a deep breath. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and my medical bag from the cabin, and whiskey, he'll need it." The men scattered to obey while Grace spoke softly to Jesse, explaining what she needed to do. The break was bad. The bone had punctured the skin, and without proper treatment, he risked losing the leg or worse. By the time Zach arrived, Grace had cleaned the wound and was preparing to set the bone. She looked up as he entered, his face grim with concern. "How bad?" he asked without preamble. "Compound fracture," Grace replied. "I need to set it before infection sets in, but it will take strength to hold him still." Her eyes met his. "I'll need your help." Zach nodded once, removing his coat. "Tell me what to do." What followed tested Grace's skills more than anything in her years of practice. With Zach and Ellie holding Jesse immobile and Thomas administering whiskey, Grace manipulated the broken bone back into alignment. Jesse's screams echoed in the small room despite the alcohol dulling his senses. Once the bone was set, Grace cleaned the wound thoroughly with a solution of yarrow and golden seal, then bound the leg with splints made from pieces of a wooden crate. "Will he keep the leg?" Zach asked quietly as they stepped outside, leaving Jesse sleeping under the influence of a strong sedative tea. "If infection doesn't set in," Grace answered honestly, "the next few days will tell." Zach studied her face, noted the exhaustion in her eyes and the blood staining her sleeves. Without warning, he reached out and drew her into his arms, holding her against his chest in a firm embrace. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. Grace stood frozen for a moment, then slowly relaxed into his warmth, allowing herself to accept the comfort he offered. When they finally separated, neither acknowledged the moment, but something had shifted between them, a barrier crossed that could not be rebuilt. For the next week, Grace divided her time between caring for Jesse and her regular duties. The injured cowboy developed a fever on the third day, but Grace's herbal treatments gradually brought it under control. By the 10th day, when the swelling had subsided enough for her to remove the splints and re-examine the break, she felt confident the leg would heal. "You saved his leg," Zach said as they walked back to the main house after checking on Jesse. "Probably his life." "We all did," Grace corrected. "I couldn't have managed alone." Zach stopped, turning to face her in the path. "Grace, before you came here, a break like that would have meant amputation at best, death at worst. What you did was a miracle," she supplied with a small smile. "Yes," he said simply. The directness of his response caught her off guard. "I just used the knowledge I have." "Knowledge that's rare out here, knowledge that makes you invaluable." He took a step closer. "Not just to the ranch, but to me." Grace's heart quickened. "Zach, I know it's only been a few months," he continued, "and you agreed to stay just until spring. But I'm hoping you might consider making Miracle Creek your permanent home." "Are you offering me permanent employment?" Grace asked carefully. Zach's gaze was steady. "I'm offering whatever you're willing to accept. Employment, partnership." He paused. "More if you were inclined." The implication hung in the air between them. Grace had known for weeks that her feelings for Zachariah Hayes had grown beyond gratitude or friendship, but she had not allowed herself to hope he might feel the same. "I've been alone a long time," she said softly. "Since my father died, I haven't had a place that felt like home." "And does Miracle Creek feel like home?" Grace looked around at the snow-covered valley, the buildings that had become familiar, the smoke rising from the cabin she had made her own. "It's beginning to." Zach smiled, and Grace thought it might be the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "That's a start." Winter gradually yielded to spring. The snow melted, revealing muddy ground that slowly greened as the days lengthened. Jesse's leg healed well enough that he could walk with only a slight limp, and the calving season brought new life to the ranch. Grace's garden plot expanded beyond the lean-to to a fenced area behind her cabin, where she planted rows of medicinal herbs and vegetables. Her practice grew as well, drawing patients from as far as Redemption Creek, including, to her surprise, the wife of the miner who had been first to denounce her as a fraud. "My husband would have a fit if he knew I was here," Mrs. Thornfield confessed as Grace prepared a tea to ease her breathing. "But Dr. Simmons in Cheyenne says there's nothing more to be done, and I heard how you saved that cowboy's leg." "The tea won't cure your consumption," Grace warned, the memory of past accusations still fresh. "But it may ease your symptoms and help you rest." "That's all I'm asking for, dear," the woman said, patting Grace's hand. "A little comfort is miracle enough for me." As word spread of Jesse's recovery and other successful treatments, the attitudes in Redemption Creek began to shift. Sheriff Adams still regarded Grace with suspicion when she accompanied Zach to town for supplies, but others greeted her with newfound respect. "Seems your reputation is improving," Zach observed as they loaded supplies into their wagon one April afternoon. "Apparently all it took was saving a man's leg and enduring the worst winter in recent memory," Grace replied dryly. Zach laughed. "Well, I'd say you've earned their respect." He hesitated, then added, "The general store had a letter for you from some doctor in Denver." Grace accepted the envelope, recognizing the handwriting immediately. "Dr. Williams, I wrote to him about Jesse's case. He's an old friend of my father's." She opened the letter and scanned its contents, her expression growing more animated as she read. "Good news?" Zach asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Very," Grace confirmed. "Dr. Williams was impressed with my description of Jesse's treatment. He's invited me to Denver to discuss my methods and possibly collaborate on a manual of frontier medicine." She looked up, eyes bright with excitement. "He believes my father's work, our work, deserves wider recognition." "That's wonderful," Zach said, though a shadow crossed his face. "When would you go?" Grace studied him for a moment, then carefully refolded the letter. "I'm not sure that I will." "But this is the recognition you've sought, vindication of your methods." "Yes," she acknowledged, But Denver is a long way from Miracle Creek. Zach's hand stilled on the wagon. Grace, I would never ask you to give up an opportunity like this. You're not asking, she pointed out. I'm choosing. Dr. Williams and his manual will still be there in a few months or even next year. She stepped closer to him. Right now I have patients who need me, a garden coming into bloom, a practice that's finally gaining acceptance. Her voice softened. And a rancher who once called me his miracle when he thought I wasn't listening. Zach's face flushed. You heard that. The night Jesse's fever broke, Grace confirmed. You were speaking to Thomas outside the bunkhouse. You said that woman is a miracle. I meant it, Zach said quietly. Not just for saving Jesse, but for everything you've brought to Miracle Creek. To me, Grace reached up to touch his cheek. Then you understand why I'm not rushing to Denver. Zach covered her hand with his own. I understand that I love you, Grace Valmont. And that I've been trying to find the courage to tell you for months. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Grace felt something inside her shift and settle, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. I love you too, she said simply. Their first kiss was witnessed by half of Redemption Creek, standing on the boardwalk outside the general store. There were a few gasps, a chuckle or two, and one clear comment from Mrs. Thornfield. Well, it's about time. When they returned to Miracle Creek that evening, the ranch hands were unsurprised by the news of their engagement. Thomas merely nodded and said, figured as much when the boss started shaving every day instead of just Sundays. As twilight settled over the valley, Zach and Grace stood on the porch of the main house, looking out over the land that had brought them together. I never expected this, Grace admitted. When I left Redemption Creek that day, I was just trying to survive another winter. And I was just looking for someone who could tend to minor injuries, Zach replied. Instead, I found the woman who would save not just my men, but me as well. We saved each other, Grace corrected, leaning against his shoulder. They were married in June, beneath the cottonwood trees by the creek that gave the ranch its name. The entire population of Miracle Creek attended, along with most of Redemption Creek and settlers from miles around. Sheriff Adams presented them with a wooden clock as a wedding gift, gruffly admitting he might have been a bit hasty in his judgment of Grace's abilities. After the ceremony, as guests enjoyed Thomas's finest cooking and music from Frank's harmonica, Grace found herself standing with Mrs. Thornfield, whose breathing had improved enough to allow her to attend. You know, the older woman said thoughtfully, when my herald was carrying on about your snake oil, I never imagined I'd be at your wedding a year later. Grace smiled. Life has a way of surprising us, indeed it does. Mrs. Thornfield patted her hand. But I'll tell you something, my dear, that husband of yours had it right all along. You are a miracle not because of any magical cures, but because you brought something this territory desperately needed. Medical knowledge, Grace suggested. Compassion, Mrs. Thornfield corrected. And the grace to offer it even to those who scorned you. She nodded toward where Zach stood talking with his men. He saw it first, but the rest of us caught on eventually. As if sensing their conversation, Zach looked up and caught Grace's eye across the gathering. The love in his gaze was as clear as the summer sky above them, a promise fulfilled and a future unfolding. In the years that followed, Miracle Creek Ranch prospered, as did Grace's medical practice. Dr. Williams eventually visited from Denver and spent a month documenting her methods, leading to a published manual that brought recognition to frontier herbalism. Jesse's leg healed strong enough that he could ride again, though he preferred to help Grace with her expanding gardens when cattle drives came around. And when Grace gave birth to their first child, a daughter with her mother's green eyes and her father's determined spirit, Zach held the infant in his calloused hands and whispered, "Another miracle for Miracle Creek." Grace simply smiled, knowing that the greatest miracle had been finding a place to belong and a love that had transformed not just her life, but an entire community's understanding of what grace truly looked like.